No, we are going to do healthcare today, and it's a topic certainly near to my own heart. When I left college, my best friend and subsequent best friends were all in medical school, and so I watched them labor through that, and never again worried about what doctors get paid, knowing what they paid to get to be doctors. So we're going to reflect on that a little theologically here with the help of Luke chapter 13, and then move on to our distinguished panel. We've got 5 healthcare professionals and 1 returning panelist. One of my favorite stories of healing that Jesus does in the Gospels, as you know, Jesus heals all over the place in the Gospels. It's not incidental to his ministry. It's absolutely central to his ministry. And this is one of the stories where I think if you look carefully, you begin to see why it was so central to what he was doing. You will perhaps remember the quote we had from Jürgen Moltmann, when he, great German theologian, writing about the miracles of Jesus in general, and particularly his healing miracles. He says, Jesus' healings are not supernatural miracles in a natural world. They are the only truly natural thing in a world that is unnatural, demonized, and wounded. And of course, Moltmann's not for a minute denying the miraculous nature of what Jesus does in these healings, and we'll get to that momentarily. But what he is saying is that Jesus is not so much disrupting the created order, coming in with some plan B on God's part that's going to save our souls. Jesus is here to restore the created order, to bring it to its goal. And of course, he doesn't immediately do that in absolute terms, as we'll note that this woman will again be bent over in the grave. Lazarus will die again. Things are not absolutely restored, but these are tangible signs of the ultimate restoration that's coming. They're signs of hope. And so they are truly natural. Returning to our story then in Luke, one of the things that Luke provides here, though it's subtle, is, as I've said, a theological rationale for why Jesus heals in general, but then particularly why he heals on the Sabbath. Now, on the one hand, Jesus heals on the Sabbath because you gather on the synagogue at the Sabbath, and so there are people there, people with needs, and Jesus is able to address them. But we're going to see that the rationale for why Jesus insists on healing on the Sabbath goes much deeper, and that's what I want to look at now. So the woman is there. She's got a spirit of infirmity. Jesus calls and frees her, and then the ruler of the synagogue has this indignant, annoyed reaction. The ruler of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus is healed on the Sabbath, said to the people, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done." And I want to focus on this innocuous seeming little word ought, because this is really the hinge on which the passage turns. So he says it ought to be done, or it's necessary, it's fitting, it's the right thing to do to work on 6 days and then rest on the Sabbath. And of course, at a very superficial kind of a level, he's sort of correct. That is, by definition, what the Sabbath is, the day you don't work and you rest. But of course, I think even the casual reader is going to sense that this guy has spectacularly missed the magnitude of what's going on before him. That at the very least, before he gets out his rule book, he ought to think for a moment about what's just happened, that this woman has been liberated from her infirmity in miraculous fashion, and who could do that except the living God? But he just goes right to his little guidebook and says, this is what you're supposed to do, and this is what you're not supposed to do. This is what ought to be done. Jesus then gives a very interesting answer, and one, frankly, which is very much in keeping with a lot of the thought of rabbis probably around this time. So Jesus' point here in verse 15 is not going to be absolutely distinctive. There are plenty of guys, unlike this synagogue ruler, who said, sure, on the Sabbath, it's lawful to water your animals or to bring it out of the ditch. And therefore, there are some things you can do on the Sabbath, for example, provide emergency medical care, which are not prohibited by the Sabbath command. And so this is the first level I think Jesus is working at. And notice, there's that little word ought again. And when Luke wrote this, it would stick out a little more. It's necessary. And so Jesus, after lambasting this guy for being a complete hypocrite and treating this woman with such disdain and treating the miracle with such disdain, in effect says, you want to talk about what ought to happen? What ought to happen is you ought to treat this lady better than you treat your animals, or at least as well as you would treat your animals. Right? So that's part of the rhetorical force here. This is part of that hinge. You want to talk about what ought to happen? You ought to be kind to this woman, respect her, and as I've indicated, at least treat her as well as you would treat your animals. But he doesn't simply say that it's a good thing for her to be healed. I think it's stronger. He says, shouldn't she be loosed from this bond on the Sabbath day? In other words, Jesus doesn't simply seem to be saying it's permissible for her to be healed on the Sabbath day. He's saying it's desirable that she be healed on the Sabbath, that in fact the Sabbath is the perfect day to be healed. And so we ask, well, why would that be the case? It's the case because the Sabbath is meant to celebrate God's work of creation. Right? You rest and acknowledge your finitude. You humble yourself before God. But the whole point of that resting is not just a removal from work. It's a removal or an exodus into worship and praise of God for his creating and liberating power. You remember in the original Sabbath commands there in Exodus and Deuteronomy, one time it says, keep the Sabbath, honor the Sabbath, keep it holy, because in 6 days the Lord created heaven and earth. And then he says in another version of the Sabbath command, you are to liberate your animals, everything else on the Sabbath, because the Lord brought you out of Egypt. And that is, in a nutshell, the whole message of the Old Testament. The Lord is maker of heaven and earth, and he's the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. He is the creator of all things and the redeemer of all things, and the Sabbath is the day when you celebrate that. And this woman, therefore, has in effect been kept from truly keeping the Sabbath because of her infirmity. Obviously, she can keep it at one level, but she can't fully praise and celebrate God's created goodness because her little bit of the creation has been bent over all these years. And so God needs to liberate her so that she can celebrate the Sabbath. And so not only is it the case then that she may be healed on the Sabbath, Jesus is insisting that she should be healed on the Sabbath. And that's why Jesus keeps doing this all the time, deliberately on the Sabbath. Look at John 5, look at John 9. Jesus heals on the Sabbath so that people can be brought into the full celebration of God's creative and redeeming goodness. So, the Sabbath, theologically crucial to this passage and to Jesus' whole ministry. And healthcare, just getting back to our topic, is obviously a central part of that whole movement. And so now we want to think about both the differences, first of all, but transitioning towards the panel, the similarities with what we do in the healthcare business today. So there is a distinction. Jesus does, as always, what we can't do. But whenever we say Jesus does what we can't do, we always remind ourselves that Jesus is also always and ever doing what we ought to do. As the perfect human, as the true Son of God, he is a model for our own behavior in his sacrifice, in his self-giving, in his wisdom. All the things he does are things we are meant to imitate, to emulate. And so it is with healing. And that's why we think again of Moltmann's statement that Jesus' healings are not supernatural miracles in a natural world, are the only truly natural thing in a world that's unnatural, demonized, and wounded. And so if part of the goal, a major part of the goal of Jesus' healing miracles are to point towards the restoration that is to come, even as it provides examples of God's compassion and power in the present, then I would say that natural healings done in the Spirit of God are equally contributing to that fundamental message of witnessing to God's purposes, his compassion and mercy in healing people now, and healing done in Christ's name tethers us to the ultimate healing that is to come. And that's why I think that healthcare is not only a pressing need or an urgent budget line item or something that politicians ought to debate or something we all avail ourselves of. Those are all true, but they're also integrally related to the dynamics of the progress of the kingdom of God.
Okay. Steve Jameson, I'm an anesthesiologist, and I began in internal medicine and then went into anesthesia after that. My dad was a medical missionary, so he had a hospital out in Egypt, and so that's where I grew up. And it was sort of a medical world, and we never had the slightest pressure, but there was somehow an assumption that we might do this. So all three of my siblings are also in medicine, and physicians, etc. And so it was something that just sort of occurred. But I had some hiatus after college before going into medicine, and so I did a few things in between there that wound up basically where I anticipated being, thinking that this was in a way where the Lord wanted me. It was a bit of a struggle. It was a ministry of this, but it turned out to be medicine. Well, there are many dimensions I find of relating to people in the context of our relating to the Lord. And often it's very, very small things, because you can't do a whole lot without the Lord, but we're limited in what we can do publicly in terms of expressions. And so my day always begins with praying for all my patients. Don't know what's coming, but just praying that in some way I'll be able to witness to them. And usually that's not verbally, because you're constrained, but you can show love and caring and compassion just in the way you talk to people, the way you touch them, the way you deal with the small things. And I find that there are many ways in which God gives these. I'm very slow, so I need reminders all the time. And it's sort of like, I often joke, I thank God that I have to look for parking spots, because every time I look for one, I pray. It's not that I'm going to find a parking spot, it's just a reminder to pray. And so it's a wonderful thing. Well, it's the same thing, because I do the same thing, like I'm starting IVs access all day long. But after every time I get in, I say, thank you, Lord. It's just a tiny little thing, but it's a reminder. And it's a privilege to simply enjoy the Lord's presence while we're working, because I think that's part of what it means to be salt. It's often not external things that we can state or do, but it's the small ways in which we can relate. And I think that one of the things that always impresses me is the extraordinary privilege we have to be in medicine. And I mean, somebody's just trusting you there with their life. And in anesthesia, people are usually pretty nervous about that time. So, aside from the great drugs that we have, there's just, it's a real privilege to have this person entrust themselves to you. And I take that as sort of a responsibility, which allows me then to pray for them. And it's often very brief, but it's simply the privilege, I think, of being that presence. And simply prayer is a wonderful thing, because it's something we can always do. Doesn't matter what your context, but you can always be praying for somebody. And the rest of it's in the Lord's hands. So whether or not you're constrained in your witness or testimony, that's not going to bind your ability to simply pray and take care of the person in that context.
Good morning. I'm Heather Labuddy, and I'm an occupational therapist. A lot of people don't know what that is. They know what physical therapy is, so I'll just set the record straight. What we usually do, it's very broad, but occupational therapy essentially helps a patient regain their occupations of daily living. That can be ordinary things, like if they've had a stroke and they have an arm that doesn't move, how do they learn how to dress? How do they retrieve their clothes from their closet? Can they safely shower? Can they safely manage in the kitchen? Those are some of the things that are addressed. Do they have visual deficits? Are there modifications that need to be made? Is there just safety education that needs to be provided? It kind of goes on and on. So I work in acute care rehab between Beverly Hospital and Addison Gilbert Hospital. I'm also on a locked psychiatric unit at Addison Gilbert Hospital most of the time. That's my preference. I'm thinking of the locked unit where I work, and some scary situations. And I think one of my, can I say favorites? One of my favorite things to do as a Christian is to try to model respect and love for the patient that is really struggling. There could be some injurious behaviors going on, and a staff member might really be having a negative reaction. Grabbing that staff member's hand and saying, "You need to remember that she's not doing that on purpose, that she's sick," and to try to just model compassion, like right on the floor, some of the time. In the rehab setting, when I've had people that are quite ill, I like to wait for an opportunity to pray. I ask the Holy Spirit to nudge me if I'm to pray with the person or over the person. And I'm not beyond doing that. And it's not in my job set, but I just feel like occupational therapy is supposed to be very holistic, and it would be wrong not to address the spiritual needs of the patient if they are receptive to it, and if I'm getting that nudge. So I love doing that. Sometimes there'll be a situation where there are many nurses, and I'll be sitting there praying, "Lord, if you want me to pray, I'm feeling like maybe you do, and maybe those nurses are going to exit." And within a matter of moments of praying that, the nurses are gone, and I'm like, okay, I'm supposed to do this. So I'll ask for that, and I'm not expecting personally anything from it. I just feel that if God can use me that way, that I want to be used that way.
Yeah, I know.
I'm Adam Broughton, and I'm a physician assistant at Beverly Hospital and Brigham and Women's. I work in the emergency department. I've been doing emergency medicine for 10 years now. Physician assistant wasn't really on the radar until kind of halfway through college. I think, I went to Gordon College and majored in something that I really liked, and came across the career. My mother's a nurse, and kind of worked my way into medicine. I think it was kind of a career out of practicality standpoint. My faith kind of buoys me or gives me a larger perspective for what's going on. So a lot of times, many of the ED visits that we see, it's not the best day for the patient, or it's an end of life situation or something like that. So
Or it's a Sunday, right?
or it's Sunday and it's 2:30 in the morning. So it does offer, for me, a larger perspective of what I'm doing, that this time on earth is finite, but these are infinite beings that I'm helping care for. And it's hard to kind of imagine working in the emergency medicine situation without that perspective, to think, this is all the time we have, and we're going to spend, 40 hours a week, grinding it out in the ER. So it's almost like it's hard for me to imagine the other side of thinking, this is it. So it can be a dark place, and a lot of the effects of sin that we've looked at are, come into play right there in the ER. So yeah, on a day-to-day basis, it's usually kind of like a background perspective, or refreshing to come out of it, and realize that's the case. And then on the job, my perspective, or even when I tell patients, is just kind of restoring someone to their created or supposed to be state. Some of the things that I like doing would be, suturing up someone's wound, but I'll oftentimes tell them it's not me that's doing the healing. I'm just pulling the skin edges together. You know, there's no magic here. You know, like if your body didn't heal, what I am doing, you know, wouldn't matter. Or some of the critical patients that I take care of, I'm just restoring them back to, you know, the design or homeostasis or whatever it is to try to do that. So my perspective is not so much of coming in as the hero and changing everything around. It's just kind of nudging them back towards the created order. So
Hi, I'm Jana Ottinger, and I am an internist for a large multi-specialty practice in Haverhill. And a lot of what I do is think and refer people to actual healers because I'm a primary care doctor. And internal medicine doesn't cure much, but we walk along with people in the path of their illness or chronic illness. I have a long path to where I am right now. I don't know if we have enough time, but
Yeah, go.
I started in medical sales after college because I was always interested in medicine but didn't want to make the investment in going to school. And then 10 years later, I decided, okay, I guess I do want to make the investment. So dropped everything, went back to medical school when I was 30. And then that led me from North Carolina up to Massachusetts. And then I got through medical school somehow, even at the age of 30, behind all these young people who could think really fast. And so now I'm a primary care doc in the community in Haverhill. So although being an internist is actually my second career, in some ways I'm in my third career because most of the time I've been an internist, I was not a Christian. I just became a Christian 5 years ago and just started actually coming to church about 2 years ago. But one thing that stands out the most, the way my faith comes into my profession now, I'm less, I think I'm more compassionate. I have to start my day every day with prayer as well, to pray, to be able to love the unlovable and to be kind to people who aren't doing what I tell them to do. And to be kind to my staff who are always throwing surprises at me and unexpected emergencies, and to have patience to try to keep on schedule. When someone comes in and says they're there for a blood pressure check, but they say, oh, my husband died last week, I'm like, oh, please let me have compassion because I just really don't have time to deal with this right now. So those kinds of things just require a lot of faith, end of life issues. So I think I enjoy my job much more since I became a Christian. And I can't, now that I do this job as a Christian, I don't know how people who aren't Christians do this job.
Morning, Miguel Martinez. This is my second time around. I'm an ER doctor for the past 30 years. How I got there, I started in art at University of Michigan, but that didn't work out. I didn't think I was good enough, so I went into medicine and got into medical school. Well, I usually start my day because not knowing what's going to happen in the ED with a short prayer as I walk into the ER. I usually ask for three things, and one is wisdom, which is what I need the most from there. Compassion, because I'm halfway through the shift, I'm gonna get tired and lose it. And the strength to get through the day, basically. So I usually, as I'm walking, I just do that small prayer. And obviously, when I'm in the ED, I do continue to calm myself through prayer. I am known in the ED as the one who has a Bible in my bag. There was an interesting case in which this older person was dying, and she requested a Bible. And I just happened to have one of those little orange Bibles in my backpack, and I brought it to her, and she held on to it. And ever since that time, the staff has known that I'm a believer, which is sometimes very difficult to be known as a believer in your workplace. because, there's times when you get tired, you get frustrated, and you don't say or do the things that you should do.
So how do you feel your career in medicine meshes with family life? And I don't know all your backgrounds, and there's different aspects of family life certainly, but I'd be interested to hear some comments on that.
That's always a challenge, and my wife will attest to that. Um, it's interesting because you see it from different perspectives when you're going through it, and when I was doing internal medicine, my residency, I mean, I was working between 100 and 120 hours a week. We didn't, we didn't have the constraints that you now have on 8-hour days or 12-hour days or something of that sort. And so that means you're gone a whole lot. And that goes on for several years. And then if you do another residency, you're back in the same boat, sort of. Wasn't quite as bad the second time around. But that meant for over 7 years of my residency training, I was really gone a great deal. And it was up to my wife and to Patricia just to sort of pull things together. But it's interesting because when you're in medicine, often your nose is just to the grindstone. You just got to do this in order to get out the other side. And so you sort of justify it to yourself that way. But I think it's by the grace of God that our children are protected sometimes during all that. And now when I have more time and sort of structured my life so that I would be more available, I often wonder, do my kids resent this or how much did they suffer and things of that sort? And somehow they're very forgiving. It's by the grace of God. But it's always a very difficult balance because medicine is such an emergent thing, and you sort of have to get there and be there and take care of things.
I would say the ER doesn't mesh at all. I mean, it works out nice from my perspective because I get days off, but in the middle of the week or so. But I think the only way that it meshes is because my wife takes care of everything that needs to happen when I'm not there. So I needed to sleep this morning because I was working late, and she got all the kids up and took them here. Are they here? So I don't have to do any of that. So.
For me, just being an occupational therapist and not as in demand as you both are, I actually kind of have the best of both worlds because I do per diem work. I can choose my days and my hours, and I tend to choose, because I have a son who has special needs, I tend to choose to work, of course, when he's in school. And the summer's going to be a bit of a juggle, but there are some programs that he'll be in as well. So I tend to do it that way. There's a commitment of 1 weekend a month, and that can be a little bit tricky, but you just kind of build up your resources and figure it out. So I'm in a completely different boat.
It's not a good mix. That's all I have. No, I think there are ways to make it a good mix. So I'm a primary care doc, so you're responsible for this population of patients, and it sort of just never ends. It can be endless. It is endless. And I became a physician before I had a family, and then I had a family, and before I even knew what it meant to have a family, and then I had my family after that. So if I had it to do over again, I'm not sure I would do it. Medicine has changed in that there are many more non-physician functions that I fulfill than there were when I first started. When I first started, it was kind of more patient care practice, jot down a couple notes. And now the notes and the non-physician functions I spend more time doing those than I actually lay hands on patients. So it's an evolving profession. I think that the pendulum will swing the other way when technology improves, and I'm optimistic about the future of the field, but it's tough.
I can echo everything. One of the things that I can point out is the sacrifices that we make, especially in the emergency department, is that we have to be open and accessible 24/7, 365 days in the year, which means that we are going to work some holidays. And that's been somewhat one of the regrets that I have missed some holidays with the family, some special functions because they get scheduled after you've already been scheduled.
Let me close us in prayer. Dear Lord, we are grateful for these people before us and the ones they represent in hospitals and doctor's office and nursing homes and everywhere else they work. Thank you for their ministry. Thank you for their service, and may you bless them with strength, bless them with wisdom as they seek to heal patients, as they seek to balance work and family and all the other commitments they have. And most of all, Lord, we pray you would give them a clear vision of the good they're doing, that as they participate in the restoration of people's lives, they really are pointing towards the ultimate restoration which you alone can bring. And so we ask that you would be with them in their work and be with us this week in all that we do. If we ask it in Jesus' name, amen.